So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. RIFKIN with a big round of applause. Hello, Mr. RIFKIN. Can you hear my voice
Greet,
well?
I can, and greetings to all of my friends in the Republic of Korea. It's such a pleasure to be with you, if not physically, at least virtually. As you know, I'm a big fan of the country and all of you've done over the years. And it's a real pleasure to be here with this World Health City Forum. It's the right theme, it's the right conference at the right time. So again, a real pleasure. I want to start on a bit of a somber note. I hope it'll end up being a liberating reflection. You'll have to decide. There was quite a bit of mention in the last talk about pandemics. There's going to be more pandemics. And there's a reason for this. When my dad was born in 1908, 84% of this planet was still wilderness. There was no human development. Today, there's only 22% of this earth is still wild. And meanwhile, we went from 780 million human beings at the beginning of the American Revolution 200 years ago to 8 billion people huddled in massive urban areas. So here's what's happening. Our viruses are now climate migrants. They are migrating. As the wilderness depletes, the viruses are hitching a ride on animals and getting closer and closer to our urban civilization. So there's going to be more pandemics. It's part of a bigger issue. And that is, we are now in the final stages of the industrial revolution of the last 2 centuries. And it's taken us to a climate extinction event. This is a real reflection of a turning point in history. When I began to work on this issue of transforming our energies from fossil fuels to renewables back in 1973, there was only a few theoretical articles about climate change. But beginning in the 1980s, it became clear that we were in trouble. Let me explain what climate change is all about. It's never explained. We are a water planet. We like to think we're on a land planet, but you know, in the 1960s, 70s, when the Apollo spacecraft mission went to the moon, one of the astronauts, as they were closing in on the moon, took out a little home camera and he took a photo of the planet, Earth, and everybody was shocked. We thought we would see a green, verdant landscape. What we saw was a blue marble. We are actually a water planet, and this is what we need to begin to understand. Here's what climate change is all about. We dug up the burial ground of a previous period of history, the Carboniferous era, 350 million years ago. We took the dead remains of animal and plant life that morphed into fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. We dug them up. And we used those fossil fuels to create the industrial civilization, the age of progress. In the process, we spewed massive amounts of these global warming gases into the atmosphere: nitrous oxide, methane, CO2. Those molecules are now blocking the sun's heat from getting off the planet. So here's the problem. For every 1 degree Celsius that the temperature goes up on this earth from global warming emissions, the atmosphere is sucking up 7% more precipitation from the oceans, from the landmass, into the clouds. So we're getting more concentrated precipitation in the clouds and massive, exponential, uncontrolled water events. What we call atmospheric rivers in the winter, pouring 14 and 15 feet of snow in regions that have never had snow. Then in the spring, the hydrosphere is rebelling with floods across all the ecosystems, every continent. They're destroying wildlife, taking human property and human lives. Then in the summer, we have the droughts for month after month after month. And then after that, we have the heat waves. 110 degrees, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, people die. And then we have these massive wildfires that are destroying whole communities and now cities in 1 day, 2 days. In the fall, we get the hurricanes and typhoons. This is all about the hydrosphere. We are a water planet. And now the hydrosphere is rebelling. It's taking us into a new era, which our scientists say is the sixth extinction of life on planet Earth. Doesn't even make the headlines. This is the most momentous moment in the history of our planet, in the history of our species. And what our scientists are telling us is we're likely to lose half the species of life on this planet in the lifetime of today's babies in Korea and other countries. We'll never see them again. We'll never hear them again. These species have been here for millions of years. The question now is, how did this happen? And where do we go from here? What's becoming increasingly clear, and this message I'm going to give now is one of hope, actually, not despair. I know that young people around the world don't know if there's going to be a future. They're frightened. They're starting to believe we live on a planet that's alien to us. We don't understand it. We don't know how we can survive it. And what they're beginning to learn is a message. This planet is much more powerful than we ever thought. And our little teeny species, Homo sapien, is much smaller and not very significant in the future evolution of this planet. That's actually good news because it tells us that we need to completely change the narrative. This narrative is not a short narrative of the age of progress. It goes far back in Western history, at least, to the age of beginning of Abrahamic religions, the book of Genesis, the first pseudo-historical account of history. And as you know, in the book of Genesis, the Lord says to Adam and Eve, do not eat the apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because if you do, I will eliminate you from paradise and you will have to live by your Torah. They defied the Lord. He said, you're now on your own. But the Lord gave Adam a gift. He said, I will give you dominion over all of life on this planet. You shall be the master of my creation. That caveat, that mandate, in all of its various forms across the world, all the way up to the fossil fuel industrial age, the age of progress, is what's taken us to where we are today. So here's the problem. We don't have a playbook for this. We don't have a playbook because we're using the same set of assumptions, the same narrative, the same worldview to try to address this climate crisis. And these assumptions that we travel with have created the crisis. So whether it's global governing institutions or individual countries or civil society, we're stuck. And the key is we're going to have to find a new playbook. I'm modestly hopeful because of the young generation of Gen Zs and the younger millennials. I saw these Friday for Future marches where young people many, many times would come out of their schools on Friday and out of their offices, young millennials, and they would, millions of them, they would assemble in 141 countries calling for a climate emergency. But what's impressive about these young people is these protests, they're not like any protest in history. We are protesting species. We protested all sorts of grievances over history. This one's different. This is the first time an entire generation across this planet has come out to protest, and they see themselves as an endangered species. And they see their fellow creatures as part of their evolutionary family. All the other divisions that keep us from each other, our geopolitics, our governance, the way we organize our economy, our religious traditions, our tribal traditions, all that's still there. But now these young people see themselves as an endangered species and their fellow creatures part of the family. That's a hopeful sign. It is clear that we need a new playbook. And let me share this with you, if I may. So some of you know I've had the privilege of serving as an advisor to the European Union, the European Commission heads of state for 22 years, and I still do. And more recently with the People's Republic of China leadership on a 13th and 14th five-year plan. And with Senator Charles Schumer, our majority leader on the Build Back Better plan. The reason I say that is that In each of these occasions, I asked these leaders to step back and ask an anthropological question. How do the great paradigm shifts in history occur? Because maybe if we know how they occur, we can get a new roadmap and a completely different compass to navigate a future that might take us into hopefully reflourishing the planet. It turns out, from an anthropological perspective, there have been a half a dozen great paradigm shifts in history. Every one of them shares a common denominator. And that is, at a moment of time, across a civilization, four defining technologies emerge. It's often serendipitous, and they converge to create an infrastructure that fundamentally changes the way we organize our day-to-day life, the way we organize governance, the economy, our approach to nature, how we educate our kids, even our temporal spatial orientation. What are these four technologies? Number one, new communication revolutions. Number two, new energy regimes. Number three, new modes of mobility and logistics. Number four, new ways of managing water. When these technologies come together in periods of history, they completely change governance. The governments don't create these infrastructures. The infrastructures determine the kind of governance that are going to be possible with these infrastructures. The economy doesn't create these infrastructures. As these infrastructures come in, they kind of dictate the kinds of approaches you might use. So let me give you a couple examples. First industrial revolution, Britain, 19th century. The communication revolution in Britain, steam-powered printing. I try to remind my friends that Korea had the print press well before a lot of other places, but steam-powered printing. And that allowed us to put out cheap newspapers and catalogs and journals and printed books for something called public schools. Later in that century, they laid out a telegraph system, instant communication across the British Isles. The energy revolution, they had depleted the forest for energy. So they had to go down under the ground and dig up the coal with a steam pump. Then they put the steam pump into an engine for mobility and logistics, and they created railroads. And all of a sudden, people were traveling at 60 miles an hour. And the water revolution was, the Brits became the first modern society since the fall of Rome to introduce water systems that went into factories and homes, and sewer systems that would take the water back for pacification and purification. The first industrial revolution took us from regional to national markets, nation states, shareholding corporations, etc. Second industrial revolution in the United States, 20th century, communication revolution, that telephone connected the continent. The energy revolution, we discovered oil in Texas, didn't have to rely on coal anymore. The mobility revolution, Henry Ford put everybody in a cheap automobile. Later, internal combustion transport for rail, inland water, ocean, air traffic. The water revolution, America was the first to create these massive hydroelectric dams, the Hoover Dam. And then a century later, it finished off with Three Gorges Dam in China. The second industrial revolution took us from urban development, railroads, to suburban development, automobiles, all over the world. That was the new infrastructure for that. It took us from national markets to globalization and global governing institutions like the World Bank, OECD, IMF, etc., UN. That second industrial revolution peaked. We all know the date in the business community. The date was July 2008. And in that month, Brent crude oil hit $147 a barrel on world markets. The whole global economy completely shut down. The financial collapse of the subprime mortgage 60 days later, that was simply an aftershock, not the earthquake. Why? This whole civilization depends on fossil fuels, the industrial age, the age of progress. It's not just powering our vehicles and heating our homes. Our food additives and preservatives, fossil fuels. Synthetic fiber for clothing, fossil fuels. Pharmaceutical products, fossil fuels. Packaging materials, construction, it's everything. So when the price of crude oil goes over 80 a barrel, all the other prices go up. At 100 a barrel, inflation goes wild, shut down. We are in a dangerous end game of trying to come back and shut down. It's an end game. So where do we go from here? We are on the cusp of a third industrial revolution that'll take us from a dying age of progress to an emerging age of resilience and a completely new narrative for how we live on this planet, a water planet. What is this revolution? The communication revolution is the internet. We have 4.5 billion people with a little smartphone in their hand, and that little smartphone has more computing power than to send our astronauts to the moon. That is amazing. Now that communication internet of big data, analytics, and algorithms is converging with a second internet. And that is, millions of us now are producing our own solar and wind in our homes, our factories, our agricultural fields, everywhere. And pretty soon it's going to be hundreds of millions, because solar and wind are now by far the cheapest energies in the world, way cheaper than nuclear, way cheaper than coal, oil, and natural gas. And they're the fastest growing energy. So what's happening is that people are generating their own solar and wind. What they're not using, they're storing in batteries and fuel cells. And then they're sharing it up on an energy internet with big data analytics and algorithms to share that solar and wind across continents and in the next 10 years under the oceans, across time zones, and actually around the world. All of this is happening. It hasn't scaled appropriately yet. And so if it's sunny in one part of the world, you collect that energy and share it. If it's wind at night in another part of the world, share it with another time zone. And so these two internets, using big data and analytics and algorithms, is now converging with a third internet, mobility and logistics internet, made up of electric and fuel cell transport, powered by solar and wind from the electricity and energy internet. And increasingly, these vehicles, road, rail, water, and maybe air traffic, will be semi-autonomous, maybe even autonomous. And they will use big data, analytics, and algorithms to move their mobility, and they will converge with the other two internets. Communication is already starting, but it isn't scaling. That's the problem. And now those three internets are converging with a fourth internet. And this is a water internet. Everybody is confused because we hear about the floods, then we hear about the droughts, then we hear about the floods, then we hear about the droughts. We're not running out of water. The water molecules on our planet have been here since virtually almost the beginning of its history and will be here to the end. They just change where they're going. So the problem is the reliable Holocene era of the last 10,000 years, good climate. We knew when the snows would come in the winter, store the water. Then in the spring, the nicer weather came, the water would go into the rivers and it would irrigate the fields. And by the summer was ending and it was getting a little drought, we could bring in the crops. No longer. Now, the question is, when does the water come, in what volume, and where? So we're creating water internets. It's just begun. And that is to collect the water with cisterns on the roofs where we live, where we work, and then place it underground in what we call microgrids, water microgrids. And then you're using big data, analytics, and algorithms, sharing that water when we need it in volume for either our home use, irrigation of our fields, our industrial use. This is a great transformation, if you will, in where we're headed. And if all of this sounds kind of common sense, even though it isn't in any textbooks, I do have it in my books, but it's not really captured the attention of the economics profession. If this sounds like common sense, how many of you in the audience have taken biology in high school? Raise your hands. Who's taken biology class? Only one person. Only one person's been in biology. All right, there's a few. Okay, there you are. I have my biology student. So in biology, you learn that every organism has to have a means to communicate. It has to have a source of energy to stay alive thermodynamically. It has to have some kind of mobility in order to survive. Even plants have to have motility. It has to have water. So these great infrastructure revolutions are simply making up social organisms, these giant social organisms that allow our species to see itself, as you will, as a cultural ecosystem. where does this take us from here? We need to begin to take a look at our political way of life. We are still really right now, as we go to the last stages of the age of progress, we are really in a very bad situation politically. Everybody's frightened. Every country's closing up. We're in this geopolitical war of everybody fighting each other in a zero-sum game. This is happening all over the world. We have to make a great shift from geopolitics to biosphere politics. And instead of adapting the planet's great spheres to us, we have to adapt us to the planet's spheres. Let me explain it. The hydrosphere, that's the animating sphere of this planet. This is a water planet. The hydrosphere determines the lithosphere, the plants, the animals, the soil. No water, no soil, no plants, no animals. The hydrosphere determines the atmosphere. The phytoplankton in the oceans provides most of the oxygen for the atmosphere. And the biosphere, which encompasses all those, makes this whole planet work. It's animated, it's patterns, it's processes, and it's all about managing the water. So, what is biosphere politics? It turns out that climate disasters do not give a damn about political boundaries. Climate disasters do not care about political boundaries. When a flood hits, or a drought, or a wildfire, or a hurricane, it affects ecosystems, all right? And because that's the case, we're beginning to understand that we have to cross political boundaries and share common ecosystems between countries and counties. We are not giving up nation states. Sovereignty is still here. We're not giving up regional and municipal governance, but we have to create an extension to what we call bioregional governance. And this is the one place America's a little ahead, actually. We have two bioregional governances in America for 30 years. One is in the Northwest Pacific states of Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and they have an international border that they share with Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Manitoba, the Yukon. It's a common ecosystem geographically, and they legislate together. They steward that commons instead of depleting it, so that future generations can live and flourish. Common sense. We have a second bioregional governance. It's in the Great Lakes. And what's interesting about the Great Lakes, those 5 lakes that you see on the map, Huron and Erie and Michigan and Ontario, et cetera, this is going to be surprising. Those 5 lakes are 20% of all the remaining fresh water on the entire planet. Those 5 lakes, 20% of all the remaining fresh water. And by the way, speaking of water, the amount of water per capita today per person on this planet is half than it was 50 years ago. In other words, for every person on this planet, there's half as much water available to them today than 50 years ago, which shows we are in real trouble. China, where I've been working, announced their 8 bioregions in 2021. That's a good sign. In Europe, we're hoping to do that in the next European Commission. We're going to be moving also from globalization to glocalization. Let me talk about that just for a little bit. The industrial model is changing. The globalization favored what we call subtractive manufacturing. That was the whole base of the Industrial Revolution. Let's say you build a house, right? So you have to pare down the house. You don't use all the bricks. Some of the cement gets taken away, some of the scaffolding, in order to create the house. So it's called subtractive manufacturing. You lose a lot. We're now seeing an industrial revolution. It's called additive manufacturing. It's called 3D printing. It's called fabrication printing. So you can be an architect, for example, and you can take a feedstock, let's say cement. You don't want to use that because of CO2, but let's say you take sand or clay. That's the newest one. As you know, they use clay to build homes through all of history, and timber. So there's an architect in Italy Cucinella, he's used clay. And then the software heats up the clay, and the software then tells the clay how to pour out an entire structure with all the departments in it in 1 day, 2 days. Passive home or passive office, near zero emission. Now, how does this affect globalization? What this allows someone to do, and it's not just building, it's wind turbine bases are being 3D printed, bridges, mechanical parts and machines, all sorts of products. The UAE is dedicating, I think it's 25% of all their buildings will be 3D printed by 2030. Saudi Arabia has announced $500 billion fund to move forward. So this is starting to scale. But what this means, if let's say you're a developer in Korea, okay, because you have a lot of great construction companies, and you develop a building, you can go from a seller-buyer market to a provider-user network. You can take the software for that 3D printed building, and you can send it to a developer in the Philippines at near zero marginal cost on your cell phone in 1 minute, and set up a provider-user network so that developer, she can develop any number of homes or offices and pay a fee on a license in the provider user networks. So we're not ending globalization, but we are extending it to glocalization. And it means that we can use less of the planet and we can use it in a more effective fashion to adapt to the planet rather than adapting the planet to us. It doesn't mean the disappearance of big global companies. Some will disappear and many will not, but they will partner with small and medium-sized enterprises, high tech, in fluid platforms, in agile cooperatives all over the world as we bring together globalization with localization and to address climate change. And now I would like to switch gears fundamentally, if I could, just for a minute. What's interesting is that it isn't just about the technology. We have a crisis, and I'll share a story with you. I taught the advanced management program at the Wharton School for 15 years. I was a student there back in the 60s, but I taught the program for about 15 years later on, where we bring in business leaders and government leaders from around the world for 5 weeks of rethinking their mission. And generally on the first day, I would say to the leaders, I would say, go to your dorm tonight, your dormitory, and think about the worst crisis that could confront your company or your government on your watch, and come back and talk about it. The second day, I say to the business leaders and government leaders, go back to your dormitory tonight. Again, think of the worst crisis that could confront your company and how that may be your greatest opportunity. Crisis creates opportunity through history. This is the greatest crisis we've ever faced. The last extinction event was 65 million years ago. The entire infrastructure of this planet, as I speak to you today, the entire infrastructure, it's all a stranded asset, all of it, everything. It was not designed for a global warming planet. And that's why the infrastructure is being affected all over the world. That's an opportunity. We have to remake a completely new infrastructure, communication internet, converging with the energy internet, solar and wind, mobility and logistics internet, electric and fuel cell powered transport, the water internets. We have to take all the building infrastructure, and each building becomes an open node. Each building has solar, if possible, a vertical wind nearby. Each building has an edge data center, so they can actually share distributed power in fluid networks. Each building has batteries and fuel cells to store energy, or your electric vehicles, send power back to the grid. The first and second industrial revolution infrastructures, they were designed to be centralized because fossil fuels are so damn expensive. Nobody could afford it on their own. They had to have shareholding corporations. And what happened is every sector, 4 or 5, a half a dozen major players dominated the sectors. So what we ended up with 200 years later is 500 global companies, many of them I work with. They're 1/3 of the GDP of the whole world. They only have 64 million workers out of a workforce of 3.5 billion people. So what I'm saying is many of these global companies will continue, but they will work with SMEs and high tech and localized projects in a bioregional world. And we have to put this all together. And we're running out of time. It's a huge opportunity. And right now, that opportunity is ripe because billions of dollars have come out of fossil fuels. They come out because they're stranded assets, and they're looking for scaled projects. Pension funds, $40 trillion. Insurance funds, $22 trillion. We need to begin scaling. The problem is local governments around the world are still doing pilot projects. A couple electric buses, some LEED buildings, some bike paths. So we need to begin to have places like Korea, which are such a powerhouse on bioregional governance, to begin to encourage these roadmaps for infrastructure transitions. In the last bit of time that I have with you, I want to completely change direction, if I may. And that is, I want to share two stories with you, which are going to give everybody heart and hope, real heart and hope. And what I'm about to say, you will pass on, I'm sure. Our National Institutes of Health in the US, which is 2 blocks away from my building here, our great scientists have come up with a new project. It's called the Human Microbiome Project. And the EU has joined, and 4 other countries, including the Republic of Korea. What your scientists are doing will change the entire story after you hear this. The Human Microbiome Project, our scientists are telling us that each of us in this room today is an ecosystem. Literally, not a metaphor, we're each an ecosystem. For example, we like to think that our body is with us once we mature, we have born, we mature. No, the human skeleton is replaced every 10 years, the whole skeleton. The liver is replaced every year, the stomach cell every month. So we're taking in elements from the hydrosphere. The water comes into our body, it's 60% of our body, it metabolizes our tissues. Then those molecules go somewhere else. The phosphorus in my tooth here, that came from a mountain. The mountain was degraded by the waters into sediment. And then those elements in the sediment are taken up by plants and animals, and then they come into our bodies, and then they go somewhere else. And then it gets even more interesting. The scientists are saying to us, we're not alone in our bodies. You want to talk about health? This is the new approach to world health. They're saying that there are millions of other creatures in our bodies. Proteus, archaea, fungi, bacteria, and viruses. Only 44% of the cells in our human body are human. The other 56% of the cells belong to the other creatures. Only 20,000 human genes in our body. Millions of other genes belong to these other creatures. So what the scientists are telling us in the Republic of Korea Scientific Institution and the US and Europe, we are each an ecosystem. We are nature. We're part of nature. We're not separate. We don't control it. We don't dominate it. This allows us to readapt and learn instead of trying to adapt the entire planet to our species for only our opulence and utility. We need to turn around with very critical scientific knowledge and learn how to readapt our species to the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. And this is very heartening news. I want to share with you one other, I think, important piece of news. And that is that I have a lot of people saying, can we make it? Are we going to be able to survive? Are we going to be able to flourish? Or is it all hopeless? I think there's a strong message here. The Smithsonian Institution, our great museums in Washington, D.C., which you've traveled to and visited, our anthropologists did a study a few years ago, and it's really eye-opening. They asked, how did our species survive? This tiny little creature with 2 little legs, not very strong. How did we survive? The old story was the last ice age receded 11,000 years ago. No more nomadic life. Nice weather came along. We settled down to agriculture, pastoralization, all the way to the industrial age. Well, it doesn't turn out that was the way it happened. Our anthropologists looked back at the geological record. What they found was astounding. When our ancestors emerged on this planet 800,000 years ago, began one of the most difficult changes in climate in all of world history. Let me explain. Sometimes our planet tilts away from the Earth, the sun, and sometimes closer to the sun. There was a tilt 800,000 years ago when hominids developed, and then Neanderthals, and then Homo sapiens. And during that 800,000 years, the new cycle was 100,000 years ice age, 10,000 years warming. 100,000 years ice age, 10,000 years warming. This went on, this cycle, for 800,000 years. So the anthropologists said, how did humans survive this? And here's what they concluded. And this is so hopeful for young people. They said, we are perhaps the most adaptive species on this planet, maybe with the exception of viruses. But if we can rewild the planet, and the United Nations is saying we need to rewild 1/3 of the planet so our viruses can decentralize, but we're the most adaptive species. Why? Our anthropologists said, we have the biggest brain. We have language so we can share our knowledge with other generations that come after us and learn about the Earth. And we have the most disposable fingers and thumbs so we can make tools. And I would add one other thing. We have empathic neurons in our neural circuitry. We think elephants may have it. We're not sure about dolphins and dogs, but we have literally these mirror neurons in our neural circuitry, which allow each of us to experience another human, or it could be another creature, their grief, their joy, their pain, as if we are literally experiencing it in our own bodies, not up here. This allows us to cooperate. We are potentially a cooperative species. Many times, empathy allows us to inflate and bring large numbers of people together. Oftentimes, empathy collapses. Civilizations collapse, and we go back to bad things. Right now, we're at an inflection point where the young people are in biophilia consciousness. They have a sense of the feeling not only for their fellow human beings as endangered, but our fellow creatures. And the Republic of Korea is one of the leaders in moving these kinds of narrative changes in history. So, where does this leave us? In the new economy, we have to balance. We're not giving up geopolitics, but we have to get into biosphere politics. We are not giving up efficiency, but we have to learn that there's another temporal value called adaptivity. In nature, there's no such thing as growth. Nature is about regenerativity. Finance capital is only a derivative of ecological capital. Wealth is net primary production, photosynthesis. Gross domestic product is a terrible indicator. Quality of life indicators tells you more about whether we are having a healthy planet. And finally, we have to make a great shift, I think, from zero-sum games to network effects, and learn to live on this planet in a new way. I'm always hopeful, especially when I get to speak to folks in Korea, because you're the poster child after World War II, one of the poorest countries in the world. And you became, with all that sheer strength of your cooperation as a culture, you became one of the great economic powers on the planet. There's something about Korea's cultural tradition that's interesting, and I will leave with this thought. The Asian religions and philosophy are very interesting. In the West, we see our covenant as the overseers of nature. But if you look at Shintoism and Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism and all of those Eastern religions and philosophies, they're very interesting in a way, because they've always said that humans are part of nature. We're part of nature. We don't dominate nature. We simply are part of nature. Now, in the West, it is true that in the West, in the 19th century, we developed ecology as a science. That's a good thing. In the 20th century, the great national parks in America. Later, the environmental movement. But I think that the East and West can learn from each other. And the Abrahamic religions and the Eastern religions can learn from each other on how we can begin to, I guess what I would say is, re-heal our relationship to this planet. The reason we're having a problem with health is the planet is sick. And the hydrosphere is trying to find a new equilibrium. And our responsibility as a species is to and join it with what we would call biosphere and biophilia consciousness. And my hope is that the Republic of Korea will lead the way. This first World Health City Forum is really an important event. I hope you hold it every year. And I look forward to your country playing a lead role in helping us make a fundamental transformation so that we learn to live with a new approach to science and technology and economic activity and governance that's more in line with our ability to heal this planet, to bring health back to our ecosystems. And the last thought is this. You know, our astronauts, when they come back, I remember having breakfast with an astronaut years ago, and they all say the same thing. They come back to Earth, this beautiful blue planet, and they say, everything out there is dark. They come back and they have a new feeling of belonging to this incredible experiment called life on this blue marble. It changes their whole life. And so if we can begin to do that in each of our countries through our religious affiliations, our political affiliations, maybe we'll be on the road to rehealing the planet so that future generations, not just our species, other creatures have their right, their moment for existence on the earth. Hopefully, Korea will be at the forefront in taking us from an age of progress that is dying to an age of resilience with all the new economic opportunities and governing opportunities and educational opportunities that go with it. Thank you very much for giving me some time with you. And I look forward for more conversations as we go through the next 2 days.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rifkin, for that impressive speech, which emphasized